Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're taking a truly epic journey, diving headfirst into a fascinating, surprisingly well-documented and often wildly misunderstood corner of ancient Rome. The daily grind, the triumphs, the indignities, and yes, even the occasional moments of genuine human connection experienced by Roman working women. Forget the marble statues and the grand speeches of toga-clad senators. We're pulling back the curtain on a world that kept the empire, well, stimulated in ways you might not expect. So, before you get comfortable, grab your favourite amphora of diluted wine, settle in, and take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on this historical deep dive from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's truly ease into tonight's sprawling journey together. Room with a view, of a wall, the glamorous life of a Roman working woman. You wake up, or perhaps more accurately, you regain consciousness with a groan that might or might not be entirely your own. You're in a space so cramped you can barely turn around without elbowing a wall or a strategically placed chamber pot. Congratulations, you're experiencing the ancient Roman version of a work-from-home setup. If your home was a broom closet, your job involved rather a lot of body oil, and your commute was a mere shuffle. These tiny, windowless chambers were standard issue for a significant portion of Rome's working women. You'd find them packed into lupanars, brothels, tucked above bustling taverns, or even crammed into the upper floors of public bathhouses. Imagine a studio apartment, but designed by someone who harboured a deep-seated hatred for natural light, fresh air, and anything resembling personal space. Your mattress, a rather unconvincing pile of straw, feels suspiciously lumpy, and yes, it's quite possibly shared with a rotating cast of fleas and smells faintly, but persistently of stale wine, wood smoke, and a profound sense of déjà vu. If the gods of fortune are smiling upon you, there's a small, flickering oil lamp in the corner, casting more shadows than light. If you're really lucky, it hasn't been stolen by a particularly entrepreneurial fellow tenant or a customer with sticky fingers. Your few earthly possessions, a chipped bronze mirror, a comb with missing teeth, and perhaps a small pot of cheap lead-based makeup, are shoved haphazardly into a corner, looking as though they too are utterly exhausted by their existence. There's certainly no running water, no sophisticated plumbing, just a bucket in the corner that you try very, very hard not to think about. Bathing? That's a collective activity scheduled for later at the nearest public bathhouse, where the water is communal, the conversations are loud, and the awkward eye contact with fellow Romans of all social strata is, shall we say, utterly abundant and completely free. But there's no time to linger, no opportunity for leisurely contemplation, because your room is also your office, and business hours are fluid. Whenever someone knocks, or more typically barges in, or simply yells your name through the flimsy curtain that serves as your door. Yes, true privacy is an utterly alien concept here in Rome. Walls are more like decorative suggestions, and doors are often just flimsy bits of fabric, barely hinting at separation. Most days kick off with a frantic, hurried clean-up of your minuscule domain. You'll sweep out yesterday's dust, wipe down the pervasive wine stains, and try to locate any sandals lost or forgotten by last night's visitors. Then comes the critical prep phase, a liberal dusting of face powder to mask the perpetual fatigue, a dash of rouge for a fleeting flush, and enough perfume to qualify as a fire hazard. You're not aiming to smell good precisely. You're simply aiming to smell better than the next woman, or, more importantly, better than the unwashed client who just stumbled through the door. You practice your best sultry, half-awake smile in the bronze mirror, not because you believe it's particularly effective, but because the mere act of pretending helps you maintain a shred of professional dignity. A customer once described you as charmingly awake, and you've been riding the emotional high from that tiny compliment ever since, because here in the cellar, every single day begins exactly the same, cramped, rushed, and filled with just enough sheer will to make it to lunchtime. The art of the ancient glow-up, perfumes, powders, and public baths. After reluctantly regaining consciousness in your glorified broom closet, the next crucial step is preparing for another day of attempting to impress clients and, perhaps even more daunting, surviving the relentless gauntlet of public judgment. But first, hygiene, or what passed for it in ancient Rome. It's important to remember that the luxury of a private bathroom simply didn't exist for most people. That particular indulgence was strictly reserved for the fabulously wealthy, and even their bathrooms were often just elaborate pots with lofty ambitions and complex drainage systems. As a working girl in a sprawling city that paradoxically worshipped pristine marble statues while simultaneously embracing open sewers, your best and often only option for a semblance of cleanliness was the nearest public fountain, or, if you were feeling particularly daring and flush with asses, the public bathhouse. Your choice largely depended on your mood and your personal threshold for awkward communal nudity. If you're perpetually pressed for time, and let's be honest, you usually are with the next client potentially just around the corner, you opt for the quick, bracing rinse at the communal fountain. You splash handfuls of surprisingly cold water on your face, rinse out your mouth with a swig of wine if you're feeling exceptionally fancy, and offer a silent prayer that the fountain hasn't been used as a communal chicken washing station earlier that morning. There's certainly no soap in sight, but if business has been surprisingly good, you might have a precious small lump of natron, a salty cleaning powder that, while effective at exfoliating your skin, also manages to strip away a bit of your self-esteem with each scrub. However, if business is blessedly slow, and you can hear the delightful jingle of a few coins in your small purse, you might just splurge on a visit to the public baths. This truly Roman institution was the great equalizer, a communal melting pot where everyone mingled, from stoic merchants and grizzled soldiers to pontificating philosophers and, inevitably, that one guy who always talks way too loudly about his hemorrhoids. You'd carefully undress, store your few belongings in a small damp niche that you trust far too easily, and wade into the tepid, murky water, where floating philosophical debates mingled with someone else's suspiciously large toenail clippings. Inside, you'd endure the stifling heat of the steam room, vigorously scrape off layers of sweat and grime with a strigil, a curved metal blade designed for maximum exfoliation, and for a fleeting, glorious moment, enjoy the unparalleled sensation of being the cleanest person on your entire street. A title, mind you, that typically lasted about 5 minutes after you left the soothing embrace of the communal water. After the bath, you quickly dry off, apply another generous layer of perfume to mask any lingering eau de bathhouse, and desperately try to recall if anyone in Rome has managed to invent deodorant yet. A quick check of the historical records confirms, nope, not yet. To complete your meticulous Roman glow-up, you'd apply a fresh dusting of chalk-based face powder, a subtle hint of rouge for your cheeks and lips, and a thick application of kohl around your eyes. This wasn't necessarily to highlight your stunning beauty, but rather to skillfully conceal the profound fatigue etched into your features. Clients, you see, weren't paying to witness the weary woman who had already navigated the demands of 3 senators and a particularly demanding sailor before noon. They were paying for an illusion of mystery, an aura of allure, and, most importantly, someone who definitely didn't smell like old lentils. The toga that spoke volumes. Roman fashion statements. Now that you're thoroughly washed, or at least convincingly perfumed to within an inch of your life, it's time for the sartorial declaration, getting dressed. While Roman society was awash with incredibly complicated and often contradictory opinions about fashion, there was one particular outfit that made your profession absolutely, unequivocally clear: the female toga. Yes, that flowing, voluminous white garment we typically associate with dignified senators, all-powerful emperors, and perhaps overly enthusiastic frat parties. But here's the crucial, often overlooked twist. In ancient Rome, a woman wearing a toga wasn't making a subtle political statement. She was making an extremely blunt professional one. Her toga was, in essence, a walking, breathing, visual billboard that loudly proclaimed, "I am definitively not a respectable matron, and yes, I am most certainly available for negotiation." Proper, virtuous Roman women, The ones who embodied the ideal of domesticity and modesty wore the stola. This was a long, layered, and often conservative dress that subtly communicated, "My husband meticulously controls my dowry, and I am safely tucked into bed by 9 p.m. Thank you very much." Prostitutes, by stark contrast, were legally forbidden from wearing the stola. Instead, they were required by law to wear a toga, which was often deliberately shorter, vibrantly coloured, and intentionally flashy. Forget the dignified draping of a Grecian goddess. Think less understated elegance and more visible from across the entire forum. This striking ensemble was usually accessorized with an array of cheap, eye-catching jewellery, perhaps clunky bronze or brightly coloured glass beads, maybe some overtly loud earrings that jangled with every step. The overarching goal wasn't elegance, refinement, or even comfort. It was pure, unadulterated visibility. When you're locked in fierce competition with 20 other women within a 100-metre radius, subtlety is a luxury you simply cannot afford, a whisper lost in a cacophony of shouts. As for footwear, it was typically simple, practical sandals, or perhaps even barefoot, depending entirely on your specific location and your current budget. Comfort, predictably, was never a priority. After all, you were going to spend the vast majority of your day standing, walking, and occasionally sprinting away from a particularly bad client or an overzealous, self-appointed moralist. Your hair, too, was its own distinct ordeal. Roman prostitutes frequently curled, elaborately styled, and often dyed their hair, sometimes resorting to wearing wigs, especially the highly coveted blonde ones imported all the way from Gaul. Blonde hair carried a certain exotic, almost scandalous appeal in Rome, much like an imported luxury soap, only, more vibrantly alive. And let's not forget those crucial finishing touches. A pale face powder meticulously applied to create a stark contrast with vibrantly red lips and cheeks, and thick, dramatic kohl eyeliner to make your eyes pop, or at the very least, appear less chronically sleep-deprived. Once fully dressed and adorned, your appearance was undeniably obvious. And that, precisely, was the entire point. In a bustling city of 1 million people, where anonymity was the norm, your outfit served as your essential business card. If it succeeded in making you look bold, unmistakably scandalous, and clearly economically available, then congratulations, you were perfectly ready for another glorious, utterly exhausting day of being simultaneously judged by society and actively funded by its hidden desires. Marketing in the forum, graffiti, gestures and groans. So, you're finally dressed, meticulously painted, generously perfumed, and with just enough residual confidence to convincingly fake a good mood. Now comes the truly exhilarating part of your day. Drumming up business in a city where seemingly everyone craves affection, but pretends to be utterly shocked and morally outraged when they discover it's actually for sale. In ancient Rome, the concept of marketing was about as subtle as a gladiator fight in the forum. There were no neatly printed pamphlets, no intricately designed websites, and absolutely, positively, no branding consultants to guide your strategic messaging. If you wanted clients, you had to be seen, be loud, or achieve a kind of perverse immortality through graffiti, preferably all three for maximum impact. Let's begin with your prime location strategy. If you were fortunate enough to work out of a lupinar, brothel, your office was already strategically built for optimal visibility. Brothels were almost always situated in prime real estate, nestled near the bustling public bathhouses, adjacent to the clamour of the markets, or conveniently alongside popular drinking establishments. In short, anywhere and everywhere that people might already be sweaty, bored, slightly tipsy, or simply easily persuaded. Think of it as ancient Roman foot traffic optimization, honed to perfection. You'd position yourself in the doorway, wearing your finest look at me outfit, and with a practiced smile, you'd call out to passers-by. Your pitch was a carefully calibrated mixture of flattery, quick-fire negotiation, and tantalizing, time-sensitive offers. 2 denarii if you're quick, handsome. Might sound desperate to a modern ear, but hey, rent was perpetually due and you just overheard the next girl over drop her rate to a single denarius. So competition was fierce. If you were a freelance operator, your entire business model hinged on roaming visibility. You might strategically hover near the grand temples, because, let's face it, nothing quite says divine inspiration like a dash of earthly temptation, or you'd casually loiter around the taverns, ready to flirt with a tipsy legionary who, after a few rounds of cheap wine, still had some coin left and, conveniently, a severely questionable judgment. But perhaps the most bizarre, and yet undeniably effective form of ancient Roman advertising was wall graffiti. Yes, the ruins of Pompeii have immortalized the true genius of ancient street marketing. Brothel walls were literally plastered with handwritten reviews and personal endorsements, much like an ancient Yelp. You'd find gems like, "Maritimus gave me the best time of his life," or "Felicia, 2 denarii, very fast service." These weren't mere acts of vandalism, they were raw, unfiltered, unregulated, and incredibly public endorsements. Some enterprising women even paid someone to meticulously scratch their name and specialty somewhere highly visible, usually near tavern entrances or prominently displayed on public columns. Others, perhaps a little more laid back, simply let their clients do the writing, which, as you might expect, ranged from glowing, poetic praise to utterly confused haikus about being robbed or finding a lost sandal. All of this vibrant, chaotic marketing made one thing abundantly clear. A working woman's survival in ancient Rome depended just as much on her marketing prowess as it did on her actual skills. If people didn't know your name, your rates, and your approximate level of enthusiasm, or at least your ability to convincingly fake it, someone else was undoubtedly securing that precious business. Because in ancient Rome, much like today, the true secret to success wasn't always sheer talent. Sometimes it was simply better, louder, and more visible PR. The price of pleasure, from asses to accolades. So, you've successfully advertised yourself, perfected your alluring outfit, applied enough eyeliner to rival a Roman emperor, and mustered just enough inner confidence to convincingly fake a good mood. Now comes the truly delicate dance, discussing pricing. This is the part where ancient Rome, with all its grand philosophical pronouncements, pretends to operate as a free market while subtly, or not so subtly, judging your every negotiation anyway. Let's be crystal clear. There were no universal union rates, no official price lists printed on papyrus. Prices were a constantly fluctuating tango, dictated by supply, demand, and whatever you could shrewdly negotiate before a client attempted to barter you down with a stale loaf of bread or a particularly shiny pebble. For street-level workers, or those operating out of the grittier, lower-end lupanars, prices could plummet to as little as 1 or 2 asses, a minuscule bronze coin that wouldn't even buy you a single, watered-down glass of wine. That's right, some clients were effectively paying less than the cost of a mediocre lunch. If that sounds profoundly depressing, remember that for some women, their desperate circumstances meant they accepted payment in non-monetary forms. A few bites of food, a pair of worn sandals, or, most dishearteningly, vague and often empty promises. Yes, in a city that commanded an empire's worth of coinage, the ancient equivalent of an IOU was still a grim reality. On the flip side, the high-end prostitutes, often elegantly referred to as meretresses, operated more akin to luxury brands in today's market. These elite women could command prices in denarii, silver coins, sometimes demanding multiple coins per client, especially if their repertoire extended far beyond the bedroom. This included skills like engaging, intellectual conversation, proficiency in playing musical instruments, reciting poetry with genuine flair, or even basic literacy. Anything that allowed a client to delude himself into believing he wasn't just hiring companionship, but rather acquiring a touch of elevated taste and refinement. Some of these astute professionals even cultivated distinct niches, not architectural nooks, but clever marketing specializations. Perhaps you were known for exclusively catering to the more sophisticated tastes of sailors, or for performing mesmerizing erotic dances, or, dare we imagine, for reciting deeply philosophical poetry during the act itself. Don't laugh. Ovid, that master of Roman seduction, probably inspired someone. The more unique and specialized your brand became, the less replaceable you were in a saturated market. Repeat clients might occasionally receive a discount or not. It depended entirely on their promptness in payment and whether or not they consistently smelled like fermented cabbage. However, a significant portion of your hard-earned income often vanished before it even reached your hand. If you worked under the auspices of a pimp, Leno, or a brothel owner, Lena, a hefty, often unnegotiable cut of your earnings was summarily deducted. And for some women, their situation was far more dire. They were enslaved, meaning they received no direct payment at all. Their existence was solely predicated on basic food, rudimentary shelter, and a perpetually vague, often illusory promise that one day, perhaps, they might somehow accumulate enough to purchase their freedom if they miraculously won the ancient Roman lottery. Welcome to the Lupinar, a sweaty stone maze of bad decisions. Welcome, intrepid traveller, to the Lupinar, the quintessential Roman brothel. Let's be clear from the outset, it was not a bastion of luxury, comfort, or even tasteful decor. However, it did boast walls which, in the grand scheme of things, already elevated it to a higher state of dignity than, say, conducting business behind a particularly smelly tavern. Technically, it was a designated place of business. Realistically, it was a sweaty, claustrophobic stone maze of questionable decisions and fleeting encounters. The very term lupinar itself derives from lupa, which literally means she-wolf. The Romans, with their typical flair for blunt euphemism, used this as slang for a prostitute. So, yes, your professional job title was also, quite literally, an animal comparison. Not exactly empowering, but at least it was consistently unambiguous. Most lupinars were two-story buildings, unceremoniously crammed between the steamy public bathhouses and the raucous, wine-soaked bars. This strategic placement was perfect for maximizing foot traffic, particularly from half-drunk senators looking to escape their marital duties and bored sailors fresh off a long voyage and eager for distraction. Inside, you'd navigate a narrow, often dimly lit hallway, lined on both sides with a series of tiny identical rooms. Each chamber was minimally equipped with a hard, unyielding stone bed, topped with a thin, questionably clean mattress, and just enough confined space to allow for a profound reconsideration of one's life choices. There were no actual doors, just flimsy, often threadbare curtains that offered the illusion of privacy, embodying an open floor plan vibe that no one truly desired. True privacy, as we've established, was a privilege reserved exclusively for wealthy matrons. Here, you contended with perpetually damp linen and the ceaseless symphony of someone snoring loudly through the wafer-thin wall, a constant reminder that you were most certainly not alone. Of course, a properly run lupinar was home to several working women, all overseen by one particularly delightful parasite known as the Leno, pimp, or Lena, madam. Their primary occupation was to extract a hefty cut of your meagre earnings, offer vague promises of repairs to the establishment that miraculously never materialized, and occasionally punctuate the general din with sharp, authoritative yells like, "Work faster, he's important, apparently." The clientele was a fascinating cross-section of Roman society. Nervous, clumsy teenagers embarking on their first illicit adventure, burly, sweaty legionaries fresh from military campaigns, and balding pontificating senators who would inevitably claim their presence was merely a philosophical visit. Some clients were in and out faster than a dropped denarius. Others, bless their hearts, would attempt to engage you in lengthy, dreary conversations about their latest attempts at poetry, which, frankly, were often worse than the act itself. During periods of downtime, you'd typically sit near the entrance, perfecting your best "I'm flirty but dead inside" expression, while dutifully calling out the stream of passing foot traffic. Your marketing strategy was largely volume-based. 2 coins special today. I'll even pretend to listen to your problems. And yes, as previously noted, the walls were an absolute canvas of ancient graffiti, a constant unfiltered stream of ancient Yelp reviews lovingly etched into the plaster. You'd find declarations like, "Felix was here twice," or the concise but compelling, "Ties gives a good time." Occasionally, a more artistically inclined patron would even draw crude pictures. Proportions were rarely accurate, but the artist's confidence, remarkably, was never in short supply. Working in a lupinar was far from glamorous, but it offered a consistent, if meagre, existence. A roof over your head, however leaky, a bed, if you squinted hard enough, and if nothing else, a front row seat to humanity's weirdest, most primal parade. Tavern tales, wine, winks, and what was that smell? Not every Roman working woman found herself confined to the walls of a lupinar. Some, either by choice or assignment, preferred or were relegated to the equally glamorous world of taverns. If the brothel could be likened to a chaotic, overly intimate office cubicle, the tavern was more akin to working in an open-air startup, more vomit, fewer stock options, and a perpetually sticky floor. Taverns, known as corponae or popinae, were the vibrant, often raucous gathering places for Rome's finest drunkards, weary merchants, off-duty soldiers, and inevitably a variety of shifty characters named Gaius nursing gambling debts. Here, they gathered to drink cheap, watered-down wine, engage in loud arguments, and pretend they understood the intricate verses of Virgil. For the working women assigned to these establishments, the unwritten motto was simple and clear. Serve the wine, sell the charm, and for the love of all the gods, dodge the gropes. A typical shift involved the relentless task of pouring shockingly watered-down wine into suspiciously dirty cups for patrons who, by that point, wouldn't have noticed the difference anyway. Simultaneously, with your other hand, you perfected the delicate art of flirting, just enough to keep the denarii flowing, but not so much that a full-blown brawl erupted. Unless, of course, that brawl promised to be particularly entertaining, in which case you'd subtly encourage it and carry on. Unlike the more specialised lupinars, taverns were technically food establishments, providing the delightful lingering backdrop of boiled cabbage, pungent fish sauce, garum, and a pervasive, multi-layered body odour. It was an aroma that clung to your tunic and, seemingly to your very soul, a constant olfactory companion. But this culinary setting also presented a unique opportunity. You could often upsell a client with a strategically timed offer. For 2 more coins, I'll pretend you don't reek of garum. Some women working in taverns confined their activities to the back rooms or upstairs areas, effectively transforming the tavern into a part-time brothel complete with table service. Others kept things far more casual, offering simple companionship, a brief lap sit, and heavily suggestive compliments like, "Your toga looks remarkably clean today." In ancient Rome, believe it or not, this was considered high praise indeed. Payment was almost always immediate. The concept of credit simply did not exist in this line of work. If a client dared to attempt to delay payment, you had a repertoire of well-honed options. You could yell loudly, issue a theatrical threat, or most effectively grab the attention of the bouncer, who was almost invariably a retired gladiator with one functional eye, a permanently short temper, and a surprising fondness for breaking kneecaps. The upside to tavern work was undeniable. Significantly more foot traffic and occasionally genuinely better tips. The downside, you were simultaneously a waitress, an impromptu therapist, and an experienced hostage negotiator, all rolled into one, and nobody tipped for emotional labour. And of course, there was the endless mind-numbing soundtrack, the constant shouting, the irritating clatter of dice, the loud boasts of liars dice players desperately trying to impress women, and the occasional, deeply philosophical argument over who truly invented democracy. Working tavern duty was unpredictable, often exhausting, and perpetually smelled like despair, but for many, it consistently paid the bills, sometimes if the customers didn't vomit on your sandals first. Street Smarts, the freelancer's guide to Roman hustle. For the truly entrepreneurial spirit, possessing no formal brothel affiliation and perhaps an overabundance of confidence, there was always the open street. Freelance prostitution in ancient Rome meant navigating a precarious tightrope between being an independent contractor and constantly whispering, "Please, dear gods, don't arrest me." The bustling Roman streets were alive with endless opportunities and equally endless sewage. Women who worked outdoors were known as prostibuli, and they roamed the labyrinthine alleys, strategically positioned themselves near bathhouse entrances, mingled in the chaotic marketplaces, and on occasion even dared to linger on temple steps, because, as we've noted, Nothing says divine intervention quite like offering a discount outside a shrine dedicated to Venus. Daylight hours offered decent foot traffic, but they were inherently risky. You constantly had to navigate the gawking stares of passing citizens, the intrusive scrutiny of nosy magistrates, and the icy glares of angry matrons who firmly believed your mere existence was solely responsible for ruining their husband's self-control. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. That particular burden rested squarely on their husbands. You dressed with deliberate, almost aggressive brightness to stand out from the throng. Short tunics, an abundance of flashy jewellery that jangled with every calculated step, and perhaps a striking wig crafted from imported German hair. The aesthetic was less about understated elegance and more about being visible from across the sprawling expanse of the Circus Maximus. Your primary objective was to expertly catch a potential client's eye before his watchful wife caught him even contemplating approaching you. Initiating contact with a prospective customer involved a delicate, almost balletic dance of flirtation, impeccable timing, and the crucial skill of not being mistaken for someone's runaway slave. You'd offer a charming smile, perhaps compliment his surprisingly clean sandals, and then, with practiced nonchalance, casually mention your rate before the local vigiles, the Roman street guards, decided that your impressive entrepreneurial spirit constituted a public disorder offence. Some clients, surprisingly, were polite and courteous. Others were aggressively cheap and prone to haggling over a single as. And a perplexing few were utterly confused, genuinely believing you were simply a friendly local and just wanted directions to the nearest bathhouse. You learned quickly, through trial and error, how to distinguish between these types, mostly by the intensity of their eye contact and the audible jingle of coins in their purse. Competition on the street was absolutely brutal. You weren't just vying for attention against your fellow prostibuli, you were also up against free lovers seeking casual encounters, drunken party girls looking for fleeting fun, and even retired gladiators who, it turned out, had developed rather surprising side hustles. Everyone, it seemed, was attempting to make a denarius. There were no benefits, no job security, just your innate charm, your sharp wits, and the critically important ability to walk very, very fast in thin sandals when the situation called for it. Some women wisely carried small, discreet knives for protection or relied on the looming presence of nearby tavern bouncers. Others simply offered fervent prayers that tonight's customers weren't philosophers with chronic commitment issues. Still, for all its inherent chaos and myriad dangers, the street scene offered distinct advantages. You set your own hours, kept all of your own hard-earned profits, and didn't have the perpetually nagging presence of a Leno breathing down your neck. Sure, the job came with the occasional drunk goat or a particularly verbose philosophical heckler, but at the very least, you were your own boss in a sprawling city where bosses were, almost universally, rarely the good guys. The emperor's cut when taxes met togas. If you thought the already challenging life of a Roman working woman couldn't possibly get any tougher, allow us to introduce your absolute least favourite client, the omnipresent Roman tax collector. Yes, the magnificent Roman Empire, the brilliant engineers who constructed awe-inspiring aqueducts, the formidable conquerors who dominated the entire Mediterranean, the champions of the elegant toga, also, in a stroke of bewildering bureaucratic genius, invented a dedicated tax specifically levied on prostitutes. This was known as the Vectigal ex capture, and it served as a stark guarantee that even your most awkward, fleeting encounters contributed directly and unequivocally to Rome's vast public infrastructure. Congratulations, your nightly services just financially underpinned the construction of another aqueduct, or perhaps a particularly impressive new public latrine. This tax wasn't merely an unofficial pocket-skimming operation. Oh no, this was a meticulously state-sanctioned system, managed by a specialized class of professional collectors known as publicani. These men were, by all accounts, a unique combination of utterly boring and absolutely terrifying. They meticulously kept detailed records on wax tablets, demanded payment exclusively in cold hard cash, and probably, while scrawling your name and tally, subtly judged your perfume choices. To legally operate within the city, a working woman had to officially register with the aediles, the Roman equivalent of a city inspector, but with a pronounced affinity for tedious paperwork and a thinly veiled air of moral superiority. Upon successful registration, your name was entered into an official, state-maintained list of sex workers. Think of it as officially joining a trade union, except there were absolutely no benefits, and instead of a membership card, you occasionally received a branding. Literally. Yes, some working women, particularly those who were enslaved, were branded or tattooed with marks like Lupa or their owner's name. If you're wondering how clients felt about this rather permanent mark, rest assured, the branding wasn't intended for their comfort. It was a clear, unambiguous mark to ensure you couldn't, at a later date, attempt to pretend to be a respectable matron. And the tax rate, it fluctuated wildly depending on your specific location, your perceived class within the profession, and whether your typical clients were melancholy senators or budget-conscious gladiators. But without fail, it always stung. You paid either per act or per week, depending on the regional customs, and there were naturally no deductions whatsoever for emotional labour, the profound discomfort of awkward silences, or the existential dread that often accompanied the job. Refusing to pay could result in hefty fines, immediate arrest, or a complete ban from working, though actual enforcement could be spotty, especially if you were adept at paying under the table or possessed a particular knack for flirting with an adel, just enough to distract him from his ledger. Still, for a profession already swimming in a pervasive sea of stigma and societal disapproval, this tax merely added insult to injury. Rome, in essence, was loudly proclaiming, "We wholeheartedly disapprove of your lifestyle choices, but also, please hand over 10% of your earnings to fund our glorious empire." But hey, on the bright side, at least you could proudly declare that your labour was directly contributing to the construction of another magnificent temple, probably dedicated to a goddess who, coincidentally, still wouldn't deign to answer your heartfelt prayers. The moralising gaze, society's judgment, Rome's hypocrisy. In the intricate tapestry of Roman society, being a working woman meant you possessed legal permission to exist, but also simultaneously social permission to be endlessly and relentlessly judged. Yes, paradoxically, prostitution was officially tolerated by the law, meticulously taxed, rigorously regulated, and even formally registered. Yet, none of these official concessions ever deterred every self-righteous senator, every pious priest, and every perpetually bored philosopher from loudly declaring their profound disapproval of your very existence, often, it must be noted, while discreetly zipping up their tunics after a visit. Enter the ever-present moral police. This wasn't an official, uniformed squad armed with batons and badges, but rather a vast, omnipresent, and entirely unpaid network of senators, priests, matrons, and self-appointed moralizing writers. Each believed it was their divinely ordained duty to shame you publicly, all while, quite frequently, privately enjoying the fruits of your labour behind firmly closed doors. At the absolute apex of this towering edifice of hypocrisy resided the Roman Senate, a venerable group of aging elites who fervently believed in preserving something they vaguely called Roman virtue. This elusive concept, conveniently, was typically defined as whatever we are not caught doing in public. Many of these very same senators would publicly rail against the perceived moral decay of the city, while simultaneously maintaining discreet, meticulously kept tabs at every single brothel from the Grand Forum to the seedy back alleys of the Suburra. Then you had the aediles, Rome's actual public officials, tasked with enforcing laws pertaining to cleanliness, public order, and, somewhat ironically, decency. Their multifaceted job description included regulating brothels, conducting regular inspections of establishments, and occasionally doling out fines to women for being too obvious about their profession. A profession that, by law, was actually required to be obvious. The irony was so thick you could carve it with a chisel. You simply couldn't make it subtle if you tried. Writers of the era, intellectual heavyweights like Juvenal and Seneca, had an absolute field day. They mockingly lampooned prostitutes in their verses, indiscriminately lumping them in with greedy merchants, loud and opinionated women, and, the ultimate horror of horrors, women who actually dared to read books. And yet, These very same moralizing writers often provided incredibly vivid, suspiciously detailed descriptions of brothel life, almost as if they themselves had conducted extensive first-hand research. Even the esteemed Roman matrons, the respectable wives of the elite, eagerly joined in the chorus of judgment. They wouldn't, of course, deign to speak to you directly on the street, but they would sweep past your corner with a withering gaze so potent it could sterilize a fig tree. Some even actively petitioned for draconian laws banning working women from wearing jewelry or, gasp, entering the public baths. A truly rich demand, considering many of their husbands treated bathhouse visits like lucrative part-time jobs. Occupational hazards, from ailments to omens. Working as a Roman working woman came with a deeply uncomfortable array of occupational hazards, chief among them disease, injury, and whatever unsettling thing that particularly boisterous sailor from Brundisium left behind. Welcome, my friends, to the health and wellness chapter of our journey, a grim reality where the only reliable prescription was a fervent hope that you somehow managed to survive. Let's begin with the elephant in the frigidarium, venereal disease. While ancient Rome lacked the sophisticated understanding of germ theory that we possess today, they were acutely aware that certain encounters with certain men invariably left you with more than just a few coins and a truly terrible poem. Roman texts remarkably describe a chilling array of symptoms, ranging from persistent, maddening itching to the far more alarming phenomenon of things falling off that absolutely shouldn't. The prevailing medical advice of the era was usually a rather dubious cocktail, a mix of stinging vinegar washes, sticky herbal ointments of questionable efficacy, and a desperate, whispered prayer to Venus, who, ironically, seemed to be more adept at inspiring the problem than providing any lasting solutions. Pregnancy was another ever-present, terrifying concern, a constant shadow lurking at the periphery of your daily existence. There was, lamentably, no equivalent of the modern birth control pill, but medieval women, resourceful by necessity, did employ a variety of options if they possessed the sheer guts and the meagre budget required. Working women often relied on natural contraceptives, like silphium, a now extinct plant famously and tragically over-harvested for this very reason, a testament to its widespread use and perceived efficacy. Animal intestines were sometimes crudely fashioned into rudimentary condoms, and wool tampons soaked in various herbal concoctions were also in circulation. The effectiveness of these methods hovered somewhere between a hopeful maybe and an outright miracle. If, despite all efforts, a pregnancy did occur, the situation became profoundly complicated. Some women, against all odds, carried to term and managed to raise their children, often within the very confines of the brothel itself, leading to a unique, often surprisingly tight-knit, albeit challenging, community. Others were forced by circumstance or desperation to give their infants up to foundling homes, or, more tragically, abandon them on the merciless open streets. Infanticide, while not officially legal, was often met with a collective turning of a blind eye, a grim practical reality that was almost a civic duty in a city struggling with poverty and overpopulation. For the myriad day-to-day ailments, the constant ache of sore muscles, the stinging of minor cuts, bouts of stress-induced rage blackouts, or simply overwhelming exhaustion, the go-to remedy was typically a generous swig of wine, a small dose of opium, or, more likely, a sharp slap from your leaner, accompanied by the curt instruction to stop whining. If these rather brutal first-line treatments failed to provide relief, you might, as a last resort, undertake a pilgrimage to a temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, and sleep on the cold floor, desperately hoping for a miraculous healing dream. Ancient Roman wellness culture was, to put it mildly, less about a relaxing spa weekend and more about a mystical nap, with a host of uncomfortable side effects. Infections were terrifyingly common, given that hygiene was more of an ambitious aspiration than a consistent practice. There were absolutely no gloves, no antiseptics, and, most disturbingly, absolutely no one, was washing their hands before sticking fingers, where fingers, quite frankly, had no business being. And let's not overlook the immense emotional toll. Depression, profound trauma, and crippling anxiety were not merely possibilities. They were an inherent, unavoidable part of the job description. Rome, notably, did not have therapists. Instead, you had the quiet camaraderie of your fellow working women, the fleeting comfort of wine, and the occasional stray cat who, bless its furry heart, listened to your woes without an ounce of judgment. The gods and the grind, divine intervention in daily hustle. In a sprawling, superstitious city where divine intervention was routinely blamed for everything from catastrophic floods to inconvenient flatulence, Roman working women weren't just adept at dodging moral judgment. They were also constantly striving to remain on the good side of a capricious pantheon of gods, or at the very least, bribe them for a measure of health, a stroke of good luck, and, most importantly, a steady stream of low-maintenance clientele. Religion in ancient Rome was a full-time, demanding job for everyone, and the gods, it was universally believed, were perpetually watching, constantly judging, and occasionally, quite whimsically, cursing your very existence. However, amidst this formidable divine assembly, there were a few deities who were, shall we say, remarkably more lenient toward your particular profession. First and foremost, there was Venus, the resplendent goddess of love, beauty, and general, delightful, poor decision-making. Many working women, seeking her beneficence, dedicated small, humble altars to her within the confines of their tiny rooms. Offerings of fresh flowers, precious perfumes, or a glistening coin were reverently made in fervent hopes of attracting wealth, enhancing their charm, or, at the very least, ensuring a steady stream of clients who didn't reek of boiled goat. Then came Fortuna, the unpredictable goddess of luck. Given the utterly random nature of your daily income, which could swing wildly from a gleaming gold bracelet one day to 3 mouldy grapes and an empty promise the next, Fortuna was indeed kind of a very big deal. You might wear a small charm bearing her likeness around your neck or discreetly mumble a quick, fervent prayer before a particularly well-dressed customer, adorned with too many rings and suspiciously clean sandals, walked through your curtained doorway. But Roman religion, much like Roman life itself, wasn't all glitter and flirtation. The darker, more pragmatic side of belief encompassed pervasive superstition, ominous omens, and the ever-present need for magical countermeasures. Because after all, when in doubt, it was always best to blame the spirits. You'd meticulously burn pungent incense to ward off the dreaded evil eye, tie vibrant red cords around your ankle for protective purposes, or, if the situation was truly dire, hire a professional witch to perform an elaborate curse on a rival prostitute's hairline. Don't laugh. Actual cursed tablets, known as defictiones, have been unearthed all over Roman brothel districts, many reading like ancient Yelp revenge reviews. May her tongue rot, may her clients dry up, may she trip in the street and land in donkey dung. If you were among the unfortunate souls who were enslaved, your prayers might also be directed towards Mercury, the swift god of commerce, travellers, and, pertinently, transactions. Because, let's be honest, your entire life was essentially one long, unending receipt. And if, through an extraordinary stroke of luck, an immense personal sacrifice, you managed to save enough to purchase your freedom, Libertas, the august goddess of liberty, would receive a very special private altar and a slightly more expensive long-burning candle. All this intricate spiritual effort wasn't merely a matter of blind tradition. It was, in its essence, a vivid manifestation of survival with a dramatic flair. When Rome consistently dealt you judgment, disease, and endlessly rude senators, the gods, in their perplexing benevolence, served as your impromptu HR department, mostly useless, occasionally surprisingly helpful, and always, always accepting of offerings. Love and lies, the heart of a Roman working woman. Love, in the complex, often brutal world of Roman prostitution, was, at best, a fleeting, pleasant delusion, and at worst, a significant financial liability draped in an ill-fitting tunic. Clients, remarkably, seemed to fall in love all the time, or at least they emphatically claimed to, usually after consuming 3 large cups of wine and delivering half a rambling monologue about their perpetually disappointing mothers. Some of these declarations were, perhaps, genuinely sincere. Many were simply fueled by drunken bravado, and a significant portion were calculated attempts to secure a discount. "But, baby, I'm different," they'd earnestly declare, clutching your hand with the desperate intensity of a tragic poet, and you, with practiced grace, would nod politely, while mentally and quite rapidly calculating exactly how much they still owed you for the current encounter. Some working women in turn reciprocated these fleeting feelings, or, more often, skillfully pretended to. Emotional labour was an inherent, non-negotiable part of the professional package. You smiled, you listened intently, you pretended his toga didn't perpetually reek of despair. For a select few clients, a genuine connection might even blossom, a nascent attachment, a flicker of true affection, or more commonly, just a profound, shared sense of mutual exhaustion. But far more often than not, romance was a perilous and unnecessary distraction, especially when you were forced to confront the harsh legal reality that Rome formally categorized you as infamous, meaning you were legally prohibited from marrying a Roman citizen, even if, against all odds, you genuinely desired to. However, this legal stricture did not, in fact, deter everyone from trying. Historical tales abound of working women who fell deeply in love with their regular patrons, women who were earnestly promised freedom, a respectable marriage, and even a charming house with a lush garden, only to find themselves cruelly abandoned the moment another, younger woman, with slightly better eyeliner strolled by. Conversely, there were also rare, poignant instances of clients who genuinely adored their favourite companion, showering them with lavish gifts, composing heartfelt poems, and, on occasion, granting them actual manumission, the highly sought-after legal act of freeing a slave. These stories, while undeniably powerful, existed as the rare exception rather than the rule in the harsh landscape of Roman life. Among fellow working women, however, genuine bonds were far more likely to form. You toiled side by side, endured the same relentless insults, and, in a grim display of shared humanity, often shared the same lice. Some of these relationships blossomed into powerful, supportive sisterhoods, forged in the crucible of shared adversity. Others evolved into quiet, hidden romantic partnerships, discreetly nurtured beneath the ever-watchful radar of Roman patriarchy, which steadfastly believed that women were incapable of falling in love with anyone who didn't possess a formidable sword collection and a sprawling vineyard. And of course, there were the necessary lies you told yourself, the comforting delusion that one day you'd finally quit, that your very best client would genuinely take you away to a life of ease, that if you could just save a little more coin, you'd open a charming perfume shop in Ostia and never, ever look back. Perhaps it wasn't true, but in Rome, a city of grand illusions and brutal realities, everyone clung to a fantasy. Yours just happened to come with better lighting and refreshingly lower expectations. The golden years, life after the lupinar. In the fiercely competitive Roman world of sex work, beauty was the primary currency, and fleeting youth was the volatile exchange rate. So, what happened when the youthful blush inevitably wore off, when the steady stream of clients began to dwindle, and when your joint started producing more unsettling creaks and pops than your cheapest earrings? The answer, simply put, was that you aged out. But, crucially, you didn't simply vanish into the ether. Some women, through years of meticulous saving, or by some miracle, having a client with both significant money and surprising follow-through, managed to purchase their freedom if they were enslaved, and, against all odds, embark on an entirely new chapter of life. The truly luckiest among them parlayed their hard-won earnings and experience into opening their own taverns or public bathhouses, wisely renting out rooms to the next generation of desperate optimists. Others transitioned into the formidable role of madams, or lenas, the brothel's version of upper management, requiring less direct action and far more shouting. As a lena, your primary assets were no longer youth or beauty. Instead, you needed to be exceptionally sharp, thoroughly intimidating, and fluent in a comprehensive range of threats, involving flying sandals and dangerously overdue debts. You meticulously ran the schedules, kept the notoriously convoluted books, and ensured that the brothel's infamous curtains were only mildly horrifying to new patrons. Clients learned to fear you, workers feigned respect in your presence, and even the formidable Iadiles visibly sighed in exasperation whenever they saw you approaching. Other retired working women, drawing on their vast accumulated knowledge of human nature, wisely leaned into the ancient art of fortune-telling. After all, when you've heard every confession, witnessed every mistake, and watched every type of desperate soul walk through your door, predicting impending doom becomes frankly second nature. A select few transitioned into unofficial therapists, becoming wise women or skilled herbalists, offering pragmatic advice laced with healthy doses of sarcasm, and occasionally slightly incorrect medical suggestions. But the vast majority of women simply kept working because Rome, a city built on ambition and ruthless practicality, was not in the habit of offering generous pensions to women who had spent 2 decades earning their living in a gaudy toga. Older working women still had clients. They simply adjusted their marketing strategy, shifting from blushing flower to experienced, discreet, and surprisingly tolerant of bad poetry. Physical appearance, while still a factor, became secondary to reputation. A woman renowned for her engaging conversation, her genuine kindness, or her mind-blowing astrology readings could remain in high demand long after her physical prime. And for those with no savings, no benevolent patrons, and no lucky breaks whatsoever, the options were undeniably grim. They might resort to begging on the streets, cleaning temples for meagre compensation, or toiling in arduous labour until their hands resembled shriveled olives. Rome, in its indifferent grandeur, cared not how you aged, only that you did so quietly and without causing a disturbance. But here, my friends, is the profound truth that history rarely carves into marble. For many, sheer survival itself was the greatest, most defiant achievement. And if you managed to reach old age with your sharp wit miraculously intact and at least one functional sandal, you were already, in your own right, an undeniable legend. Invisible ink, the undisputed presence of Roman working women. When most people conjure an image of ancient Rome, they picture gleaming marble statues, echoing grand speeches in the Senate, and emperors with wonderfully questionable family trees. What they almost universally fail to picture, however, is the very real woman leaning against a brothel doorway, subtly adjusting her elaborate wig, and mentally, with practiced speed, calculating precisely how many more coins she needs to earn to avoid starvation next week. Roman working women didn't merely exist in the shadows. They have been meticulously kept there by centuries of selective historical narratives, carefully edited out of the noble, sanitized version of the past, so that schoolchildren could learn about magnificent aqueducts without ever asking uncomfortable questions about who funded them and how. Yet, despite this historical erasure, they were, unequivocally, everywhere. Their presence is etched into the very fabric of Roman life, in the casual graffiti scrawled on public walls, in dry legal records, in biting satire, in tender poems, in illicit love letters, on chilling curse tablets, and even, remarkably, on actual mundane receipts. They were an undeniable, pervasive fixture of daily Roman life, even as the dominant society simultaneously treated them like morally contagious wallpaper, to be seen but never truly acknowledged. What traditional history usually gets profoundly wrong is the deeply ingrained assumption that these women were either entirely powerless victims or inherently morally bankrupt seductresses. In stark reality, many were incredibly savvy, remarkably adaptable, and, dare we say it, often far better at the cutthroat game of business than half the senators pontificating in the Curia. They possessed an acute understanding of how to read a client, how to shrewdly negotiate terms, how to deftly avoid danger, and how to tirelessly hustle a living in a bustling, unforgiving city that cheered on bloodthirsty gladiators, while simultaneously stoning anyone who dared to wear the wrong type of shoes. And crucially, they were not a monolithic group. Some were tragically enslaved, possessing no agency over their own bodies or lives. Some were fiercely independent and free, carving out precarious existences on the margins. Some catered exclusively to the wealthy elite, while others served anyone who possessed 2 coins and perhaps genuinely bad breath. Some undoubtedly hated every agonizing second of their lives, while others, through sheer force of will, managed to carve out small corners of power, routine, and even moments of quiet contentment. Most, like the vast majority of Romans, existed somewhere in between these extremes, perpetually pretending they weren't utterly exhausted by the relentless demands of existence. Their rich, complex stories were, almost without exception, rarely written by their own hands. Instead, they were remembered, often fleetingly, by poets searching for convenient metaphors, by moralists clutching their pearls in feigned outrage, or by diligent archaeologists painstakingly piecing together the raciest wall scribbles from Pompeii. But here's what remains truly remarkable, undeniably visible through the dust of millennia. They are still here. Their lives are imprinted in weathered stone carvings, in sarcastic, enduring graffiti, in the intricate web of laws and their clever loopholes, and in casual, offhand mentions tucked within passionate love poems. These women were systematically erased from the annals of respectability, but they were by no means erased from the tangible reality of their time. They worked, they laughed, they scammed, they wept, and they endured, all without the grand marble statues or the gilded tombs that commemorated Rome's more respectable citizens. All they left behind was sometimes just faint ink on a crumbling wall. Maritima was here, and worth every coin. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the unparalleled glory of ancient Rome, take a moment. Remember the myriad, largely forgotten working women who, in their own unique, complex, and utterly unforgettable way, made the Eternal City just a little bit more vibrant, a little more interesting, and undeniably a little more human.